some secrets are buried so deep that when they surface, they destroy everything in their path. For Prince George, the discovery that his stepmother Camilla had been feeding him lies about his beloved grandmother would shatter his world in ways no 17-year-old should ever experience. What started as innocent questions about family history would uncover a web of deception spanning years, involving forged letters, blocked phone calls, and carefully orchestrated isolation. The woman he had grown to trust as a mother figure had systematically poisoned his relationship with the one person who truly understood him. By the time Kate realized what was happening and raced against time to reconnect George with his grandmother, the damage seemed irreversible. But sometimes the truth, no matter how painful, is the only thing that can heal the deepest wounds. This is the story of how lies meant to protect became weapons of destruction, and how love fought to overcome the barriers built by fear and jealousy. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Windsor Castle as 17-year-old Prince George sat at the ornate breakfast table, absent-mindedly stirring his tea. His thoughts drifted to his grandmother, whom he had not spoken to in nearly 3 months. The silence felt wrong, like a piece of his heart had gone missing. "You seem troubled, darling," came the gentle voice of Camilla, queen consort, as she entered the dining room wearing her signature pearl necklace and a concerned expression. She had perfected this motherly tone over the years since marrying his grandfather, King Charles, and George had grown to appreciate her presence in their complicated family dynamic. George looked up from his untouched breakfast. "I was just thinking about grandmother. We used to talk every week, sometimes every few days. Now it's been months since I've heard from her." Camilla's face softened with what appeared to be genuine sympathy as she took the seat beside him. She reached across the table and gently placed her hand over his. "Oh, George, I've been meaning to speak with you about this. Your grandmother has been struggling lately." "Struggling? What do you mean?" George's voice carried the concern of a young man who had always been exceptionally close to his great-grandmother, Queen Elizabeth II. She had been his confidant, his guide through the complexities of royal life, and the one person who seemed to understand the weight of his future responsibilities. Camilla sighed deeply, her fingers adjusting the rings on her hand in what George had learned was a nervous habit. "The doctors have been concerned about her mental state. She's been experiencing some confusion, some memory issues. The family decided it would be best if she had limited visitors while she receives treatment." The words hit George like a physical blow. His grandmother had always been sharp, witty, and incredibly present in every conversation they shared. The idea of her struggling with confusion seemed impossible. "But why didn't anyone tell me? I should be there with her. She needs her family." "That's exactly what we were trying to avoid," Camilla said, her voice taking on a slightly firmer tone. "Your father and grandfather felt that seeing her in this condition would be too distressing for you. You're at such a crucial point in your education and preparation for your future role. They didn't want this to derail your progress." George pushed back from the table, his chair scraping against the marble floor. "That's not their decision to make. She's my grandmother. I have a right to see her, regardless of what condition she's in." Camilla stood as well, moving around the table with practiced grace. "Of course you do, sweetheart. But you have to understand, she's not the same person you remember. The doctors say that visitors sometimes agitate patients with these conditions. She might not even recognize you, and that could be devastating for both of you." The young prince felt tears threatening to spill from his eyes. The thought of his grandmother not recognizing him was almost too painful to bear. She had been the one constant in his life, the person who had taught him about duty, honor, and the true meaning of service to his country. Every summer at Balmoral, every Christmas at Sandringham, every quiet moment stolen away from the public eye had been precious because of her presence. "Has she asked about me?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. Camilla's hesitation was so brief that George almost missed it. She doesn't ask about much these days. The medication keeps her quite sedated. The doctors say it's for the best." George felt something break inside his chest. His grandmother, who had faced down world wars, political crises, and personal tragedies with unwavering strength, was now reduced to a medicated shadow of herself. And he wasn't allowed to be there for her in her time of need. "I want to see the medical reports," he said suddenly, surprising himself with the firmness in his voice. Camilla's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "George, those are private medical documents. Even your father doesn't have access to all of them. The Queen's personal physicians are bound by strict confidentiality agreements." "But I'm family. I'm her great-grandson and future king. Surely I have some right to know what's happening to her. You do, Camilla agreed, but you also have responsibilities to the crown that supersede personal desires. Your grandmother herself insisted that her illness remain private until she recovers. She specifically requested that you continue with your studies and royal duties without distraction. The mention of his grandmother's supposed wishes silenced George's protests. Throughout his life, she had always emphasized the importance of duty before personal feelings. If she truly wanted him to stay away, if she truly believed his presence would be harmful, then perhaps Camilla was right. When will I be able to see her? He asked, his voice small and defeated. The doctors are optimistic that with proper treatment and rest, she could make significant improvements within the next several months. Perhaps by summer, when you return from your royal tour of Australia, things will be different. George nodded slowly, though something in his gut told him this wasn't right. He had planned to spend the summer at Balmoral with his grandmother, as he had every year since childhood. It was their special time together, away from the pressures of London and the constant scrutiny of the media. She had been looking forward to it as much as he was, or at least she had been the last time they spoke. That evening, George sat in his private study, staring at his mobile phone. He had his grandmother's personal number memorized, had called it countless times over the years for everything from homework help to relationship advice. His finger hovered over the screen, torn between respect for the family's wishes and his desperate need to hear her voice. Finally, he dialed the number. It rang once, twice, 3 times before connecting to a voicemail message he had never heard before. Instead of his grandmother's familiar voice, a stereo-recorded message informed him that the number was temporarily disconnected for maintenance. Confused and increasingly worried, George tried calling Balmoral Castle directly. The call was answered by someone he didn't recognize, a man with a crisp Scottish accent who informed him that Her Majesty was not taking any calls and that all communication should go through the appropriate royal channels. "This is Prince George," he said, frustration creeping into his voice. "I'm calling to speak with my great-grandmother." "I understand, Your Royal Highness," the man replied with polite but firm resolve. "However, I have strict instructions that all calls are to be redirected to the Queen Consort's office for screening." George felt a chill run down his spine. Why would calls to his grandmother be screened through Camilla's office? When had that policy been implemented, and why hadn't anyone told him about it? After ending the call, George sat in the growing darkness of his study, pieces of a puzzle beginning to form in his mind. Something wasn't right about the situation, but he couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. His grandmother had always been fiercely independent, even in her advanced age. The idea of her willingly giving up control over her own communications seemed completely out of character. He thought back to their last conversation, trying to remember any signs of the confusion Camilla had described. His grandmother had been as sharp as ever, asking detailed questions about his studies, his friends, and his thoughts about his future role. She had seemed particularly interested in his opinions about some recent political developments, engaging him in the kind of thoughtful discussion that had always been their specialty. There had been no confusion, no memory lapses, no signs of the deterioration that supposedly necessitated her isolation from the family. If anything, she had seemed more energetic than usual, talking about her plans for the spring garden at Windsor and her excitement about their upcoming summer at Balmoral. George pulled out his laptop and began searching for any news about his grandmother's health. Surely if she was experiencing serious medical issues, there would be some mention of it in the press, even if the details were kept private. But his searches turned up nothing unusual. The most recent article showed her attending various functions, looking healthy and engaged, with no mention of any health concerns. The last public appearance had been just 2 weeks ago, at a charity gala for veterans. The photographs showed her looking radiant, speaking animatedly with attendees, and displaying none of the confusion or frailty that Camilla had described. In fact, she looked better than she had in months. As George stared at the photographs on his screen, a terrible suspicion began to take root in his mind. What if his grandmother wasn't sick at all? What if something else entirely was keeping them apart? The next morning, George decided to test his theory. He approached his father, Prince William, during breakfast, hoping for more information about his grandmother's condition. "Father, Camilla told me about grandmother's health issues. I'm concerned about her, and I think I should be allowed to visit, regardless of her condition." William looked up from his newspaper with a puzzled expression. "Health issues? What health issues?" George felt his heart skip a beat.
The confusion, the memory problems.
Camilla said the doctors recommended limiting her visitors while she receives treatment.
William's frown deepened. George, I spoke with your grandmother just yesterday about the upcoming state dinner preparations.
She was as sharp as ever, giving very specific instructions about protocol and seating arrangements. I don't know what Camilla told you, but grandmother is in excellent health. The room seemed to spin around George as the full weight of the deception hit him. Camilla had lied to him. She had deliberately kept him away from his grandmother with elaborate stories about illness and medical advice that didn't exist.
But why? Has grandmother asked about me?
George asked, his voice tight with emotion.
William's expression softened with concern.
Of course she has.
She's been asking about you constantly.
She's worried because you haven't called or visited in months.
She thought you might be angry with her about something.
George felt sick to his stomach. While he had been respecting what he thought were his grandmother's wishes for space and privacy, she had been waiting for him, worried that he was upset with her. The woman who had never failed to be there for him thought he had abandoned her.
Father, George said carefully, has Camilla been handling communications between grandmother and me? William's eyes narrowed as understanding began to dawn.
She mentioned something about wanting to help coordinate family visits to avoid overwhelming your grandmother with too many appointments. She said she was handling scheduling for several family members. The pieces were falling into place with horrifying clarity.
Camilla hadn't just lied about his grandmother's health, she had systematically blocked all communication between them.
Every phone call that should have gone through, every message that should have been delivered, every invitation that should have been extended had been intercepted and buried. George excused himself from breakfast and retreated to his room, his mind reeling with the implications of what he had discovered. For months, he had been living under the belief that his grandmother was suffering from a debilitating illness that required her isolation from family. In reality, she had been healthy and longing for contact with him, while he had been kept away by carefully constructed lies. But the question that haunted him most was why. Why would Camilla go to such elaborate lengths to keep him away from his grandmother? What could she possibly gain from destroying one of the most important relationships in his life? As he sat on his bed, staring out the window at the perfectly manicured gardens of the castle, George realized that this was only the beginning. If Camilla had lied about something this significant, what else had she been deceiving him about? How deep did this web of manipulation go? He thought about all the conversations they had shared over the years, all the advice she had given him, all the times she had positioned herself as his ally and confidant. Had any of it been genuine, or was it all part of some larger scheme? The young prince who had started the day thinking about his sick grandmother was now faced with the devastating realization that the woman he had come to trust as a mother figure had been systematically poisoning one of the most precious relationships in his life. And, somewhere in another castle, his grandmother was wondering why her beloved great-grandson had stopped loving her. George reached for his phone, his hands trembling with anger and heartbreak. It was time to make some calls of his own, and, this time, no one was going to intercept them. The truth had been hidden long enough, and he was determined to uncover every lie that had been built around it. The deception was just beginning to unravel, and George had no idea how much more devastating truth was waiting to be discovered. George spent the next 3 days conducting his own private investigation, approaching it with the same methodical determination his grandmother had taught him to apply to his studies. He started by reaching out to people he trusted completely, beginning with his personal protection officer, Detective Inspector Sarah Matthews, who had been with the family for over a decade. "Inspector Matthews," George said during their usual security briefing, "I need to ask you something in complete confidence." Sarah, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and an unshakable sense of duty, nodded seriously. "Of course, Your Royal Highness. What can I do for you?" "Over the past several months, have you been given any special instructions regarding my communications with my great-grandmother?" Sarah's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, and George caught the brief flash of discomfort in her eyes before she answered. "There have been some protocols put in place regarding family communications, yes." "What kind of protocols?" Sarah hesitated, clearly torn between her loyalty to the family and her growing concern for the young prince she had watched grow up. "I was instructed by the Queen Consort's office that all calls and messages between you and Her Majesty should be routed through them first, for security purposes." George felt his anger rising, but he kept his voice level. "Security purposes? What kind of security threat would require monitoring my conversations with my own grandmother?" I was told it was related to her health condition and the need to ensure she wasn't overwhelmed by family obligations while receiving treatment. Inspector, George said quietly, my grandmother is not ill.
There is no treatment. The Queen Consort has been lying to everyone about this. Sarah's professional composure cracked slightly. Your Royal Highness, if that's true, then, I've been participating in something I never would have agreed to.
I was told I was helping to protect Her Majesty's well-being. George placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder.
You couldn't have known. But, I need your help now to fix this. Can you tell me exactly what instructions you were given and who gave them to you?
Over the next hour, Sarah provided a detailed account of the communication protocols that had been put in place. Every phone call George attempted to make to his grandmother had been intercepted by Camilla's staff and never completed. Every message he had asked to be delivered had been acknowledged but never sent. Even his requests for information about his grandmother's condition had been filtered through Camilla's office and returned with fabricated updates. The scope of the deception was breathtaking. Camilla had essentially created a parallel reality in which George believed his grandmother was too sick to maintain contact, while his grandmother believed he had chosen to distance himself from her. The manipulation was so thorough that even well-meaning staff members like Inspector Matthews had unknowingly become part of the scheme.
There's something else, Your Royal Highness, Sarah said reluctantly.
The Queen Consort's office also instructed me to monitor your internet searches and phone usage for any attempts to contact Her Majesty directly. I was told to report such attempts immediately. George felt violated in a way he had never experienced before. Not only had Camilla cut him off from his grandmother, but she had also been spying on his private communications and internet activity. The woman he had trusted with his secrets and vulnerabilities had been systematically invading his privacy and manipulating his relationships. Inspector, from now on, I want you to ignore any instructions from the Queen Consort's office regarding my communications.
My father and grandfather are the only ones with authority over my security protocols. Understood, Your Royal Highness. And, if I may say so, I'm deeply sorry for my role in this situation. If I had known the true circumstances, I never would have participated.
After Sarah left, George sat in his study and made a list of everyone who might have information about the situation. His next conversation was with Margaret Thornton, his grandmother's longtime lady-in-waiting, whom he reached by calling Balmoral directly and, specifically requesting to speak with her.
Prince George.
Margaret's voice was filled with surprise and delight.
How wonderful to hear from you.
Her Majesty will be so pleased.
She's been asking about you constantly. Margaret, I need to ask you something important. Has my grandmother been ill recently? Has she been experiencing any confusion or memory problems?
There was a long pause before Margaret responded, and, when she did, her voice carried a note of confusion.
Ill?
Your Royal Highness, Her Majesty has been in excellent health.
She's been more active than usual, actually.
She's been working on her memoirs and spending a great deal of time in the gardens.
Why do you ask?
George closed his eyes, feeling a mixture of relief and rage.
Margaret, has anyone told you that I've been asking for space from my grandmother? That I've requested not to be contacted? Oh no, quite the opposite.
Her Majesty has been trying to reach you for months. She's left dozens of messages with various staff members asking them to ensure you receive her calls. She's been quite worried, actually.
She thought you might be upset about something she said during your last conversation.
The pain in George's chest was almost physical. His beloved grandmother had been blaming herself for his absence, wondering what she had done to drive him away. Meanwhile, he had been told she was too sick to care about anyone or anything.
Margaret, I need you to give my grandmother a message.
Tell her that I love her, that I've been trying to reach her for months, and that I'm going to see her as soon as possible. Tell her that none of this has been her fault.
Of course, Your Royal Highness. She'll be overjoyed. Should I tell her when to expect your visit? Tell her soon. Very soon.
After ending the call, George realized he needed to understand the full scope of what Camilla had done. He began calling other family members, friends, and staff, piecing together a timeline of the deception. What he discovered was even worse than he had initially imagined. His cousin Peter Phillips revealed that he had also been told George was taking a break from family events to focus on his studies and mental health. His uncle Prince Andrew mentioned that he had been informed George was going through a difficult phase and needed space from the entire family. Even his close friends had been told that he was dealing with family issues and preferred not to discuss his grandmother. Camilla had not simply blocked communication between George and his grandmother, she had created an entire narrative that explained his absence to everyone in their circles. She had anticipated questions and prepared explanations, ensuring that no one would think to investigate further or reach out to him directly. The most heartbreaking discovery came from his conversation with Father Michael, the chaplain at Windsor who had been a spiritual advisor to his grandmother for over 20 years. "Prince George, I'm so glad you called," Father Michael said warmly. "Your grandmother has been asking me to pray for your well-being. She's been quite concerned about your silence. She even asked me if she should reach out to your parents to ensure you're all right." "Father, what exactly has she told you about our communication?" "She said you haven't responded to any of her letters or calls in months. She's written you several letters, actually, beautiful handwritten notes expressing her love and concern. When you didn't respond to those, she became quite worried that something terrible had happened to you." George's hands began to shake. "Letters? What letters?" "She's written you at least a dozen letters over the past few months. She's been having them delivered through the regular Royal Mail system to ensure they reach you directly. She was particularly proud of the one she wrote for your birthday, a 4-page letter sharing some of her favorite memories of your time together." George felt physically ill. His birthday had been 2 months ago, and he had been devastated that his grandmother hadn't acknowledged it. He had assumed it was because of her supposed illness, but, in reality, she had written him a heartfelt letter that he had never received. "Father, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Has anyone from the Queen Consort's office contacted you about my grandmother or about me?" There was a long pause before Father Michael answered. "Yes, actually. I received a call about 6 months ago from someone on the Queen Consort's staff. They told me that your grandmother was experiencing some health issues and that the family had decided it would be best if she had limited contact with extended family members while she recovered. They asked me to avoid mentioning you during our conversations with her, as it might upset her if she couldn't remember you clearly." The systematic nature of the deception was staggering. Camilla had not only blocked direct communication between George and his grandmother but had also reached out to everyone in their shared circle, creating a web of lies that ensured no one would facilitate their contact or question the separation. George spent the rest of the day tracking down the truth about those missing letters. After several phone calls to various Royal Mail departments and administrative offices, he discovered that all mail addressed to him from Balmoral had been redirected to Camilla's office for security screening 6 months ago. The dozen letters his grandmother had painstakingly written by hand had been sitting in a file in Camilla's office the entire time. The violation felt complete and devastating. Not only had Camilla stolen his conversations with his grandmother, but she had also stolen his grandmother's written words of love and wisdom. Every birthday wish, every expression of concern, every piece of advice had been intercepted and hidden away. That evening, George confronted his father again, this time armed with the evidence he had gathered. "Father, I need to show you something," he said, spreading out notes from his various conversations on the coffee table in William's private study. "Camilla has been lying to everyone about grandmother's health and about my desire for contact with her." William examined the evidence with growing alarm, his expression becoming darker with each revelation. "George, this is unconscionable. If what you're saying is true, then Camilla has been manipulating not just you, but the entire family." "It's true, Father. I've spoken with at least a dozen people who were given false information. Inspector Matthews was told to monitor my communications. Father Michael was told not to mention me to grandmother. Even you were told that I needed space from family obligations." William ran his hands through his hair, a gesture George recognized as a sign of extreme stress. "I had no idea the scope of this. I thought Camilla was just trying to help coordinate family schedules. I never imagined she would. Father, I need those letters. The letters grandmother wrote to me that have been sitting in Camilla's office for months." William stood up, his jaw set with determination. "We're going to get those letters right now. And we're going to have a very serious conversation with Camilla about what she's done." As they walked through the corridors of the castle toward Camilla's office, George felt a mixture of anticipation and dread. He was finally going to reclaim his relationship with his grandmother, but he was also about to confront the woman who had betrayed his trust so completely. The conversation ahead would change everything, and there would be no going back to the comfortable lies he had been living with. The young prince who had started the week missing his grandmother was now armed with the truth about the elaborate deception that had kept them apart. But, as they approached Camilla's office, George had no idea that the confrontation ahead would reveal even darker motivations behind her actions, and that the full scope of her manipulation was yet to be uncovered. The door to Camilla's office stood before them like a barrier between George and the truth he needed to hear. Behind it waited not just stolen letters, but answers to questions about trust, family, and the lengths some people will go to in pursuit of their own agenda. William knocked firmly on the door, and George braced himself for the conversation that would either restore his faith in family or destroy it completely. Camilla looked up from her desk as William and George entered her office, her expression shifting from surprise to concern as she noticed the serious set of their faces. Her office was impeccably decorated with fresh flowers and family photographs, creating an atmosphere of warmth that now felt false and calculated to George. "William, George, what a pleasant surprise. Is everything all right?" she asked, setting down her fountain pen and giving them her full attention. William closed the door behind them and approached her desk with measured steps. "Camilla, we need to discuss the communication protocols you've established regarding George and his grandmother." George watched carefully as Camilla's expression flickered, a brief moment of panic crossing her features before she composed herself. "Of course. I've been working hard to ensure that Her Majesty isn't overwhelmed during her recovery period. The doctors have been very specific about limiting stressful interactions." "What doctors?" William asked firmly. "I spoke with grandmother yesterday, and she's in perfect health. There is no recovery period. There is no illness." The silence that followed was heavy with tension. George could see Camilla's mind working rapidly, trying to find a way to maintain her story in the face of direct contradiction from William. "I think there's been some confusion," she said carefully. "Perhaps the reports I received were outdated, or maybe there's been miscommunication between different medical teams." George stepped forward, his voice steady despite the anger burning in his chest. "Camilla, I've spent the past 3 days investigating this situation. I've spoken with Inspector Matthews, Margaret Thornton, Father Michael, and at least 8 other people who were given different versions of the same lie. You told everyone that grandmother was sick, that I needed space from family, that communications needed to be monitored for security purposes. None of it was true." Camilla's composed mask began to slip. "George, you don't understand the complexities of royal family dynamics. Sometimes decisions have to be made for the greater good, even if individuals don't immediately understand the reasoning." "The greater good?" George's voice rose slightly. "Whose greater good? Because it certainly wasn't mine or grandmother's." William leaned forward, placing his hands on Camilla's desk. "Where are the letters, Camilla? The letters George's grandmother wrote to him that were redirected to your office." For the first time since they entered the room, Camilla looked genuinely trapped. Her eyes darted between William and George, and she seemed to be calculating whether continued denial was possible. "The letters are safe," she said finally. "I was reviewing them to ensure they didn't contain anything that might be distressing to George during his preparation for his royal tour." "Distressing?" George felt his control slipping. "Letters from my grandmother expressing her love and concern for me would be distressing? Her birthday wishes and memories would be too much for me to handle?" Camilla stood up from her desk, moving around to face them directly. "George, you're very young, and you don't understand the pressures that come with your position. Your grandmother has very strong opinions about how the monarchy should function, and some of those opinions might conflict with the direction your father and grandfather want to take the institution." William's expression hardened. "What exactly are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that perhaps it's better for George to develop his own relationship with his royal duties without being overly influenced by outdated perspectives. The monarchy needs to evolve, and that evolution requires some distance from old-fashioned approaches." George stared at Camilla in disbelief. "You've been keeping me away from my grandmother because you disagree with her opinions about the monarchy?" "It's more complicated than that," Camilla said, her voice taking on a defensive edge. "Your relationship with her has always been very intense, very exclusive. She's filled your head with ideas about duty and tradition that might not serve you well in the modern world. Those ideas about duty and tradition are the foundation of everything we represent," William said sharply. "They're not outdated perspectives, they're the core values of the crown." Camilla turned to face William directly. "Are they, though?" Look at how the public responds to traditional royal behavior versus more modern approaches. Look at the popularity ratings between different members of the family. The future of the monarchy depends on adaptation, not rigid adherence to century-old traditions. George felt something crystallize in his mind as he listened to Camilla's words. This wasn't just about protecting him from stress or managing family schedules. This was about reshaping his understanding of his role by cutting him off from the person who had taught him the most about what it truly meant to serve the crown. "You've been trying to isolate me from grandmother's influence so you could replace it with your own," he said quietly.
Camilla's silence was answer enough.
William stood up straighter, his voice carrying the full authority of his position.
"I want those letters. All of them. Right now. William, I really think we should discuss this more rationally."
"Perhaps we should involve Charles in this conversation before making any hasty decisions."
"My father is at Highgrove, and this conversation is happening now." "The letters, Camilla." Reluctantly, Camilla moved to a locked filing cabinet behind her desk.
She withdrew a thick manila folder and placed it on her desk with obvious reluctance. "I want you both to know that everything I did was motivated by concern for George's well-being and the future of the monarchy." George reached for the folder with trembling hands. Inside were more than a dozen letters in his grandmother's familiar handwriting, some of them quite lengthy. The sight of her careful script, the way she formed her letters with the same precision she brought to everything else, brought tears to his eyes. He opened the first letter, dated 3 months ago, and began to read silently. "My dearest George, I hope this letter finds you well and thriving in your studies. I've been thinking about our last conversation and how proud I am of the young man you're becoming.
Your questions about the Commonwealth and its future showed such wisdom and insight."
George had to stop reading as emotion overwhelmed him. His grandmother had been thinking about their conversations, building on them, sharing her thoughts and experiences with him. Every letter was a masterpiece of love, wisdom, and guidance that had been stolen from him. "She wrote to me about everything," he said softly. "About books she thought I'd enjoy, about conversations she wanted to continue, about her memories of learning her own role. She shared stories I'd never heard before." William picked up one of the letters and began reading, his expression growing darker with each paragraph. "Camilla, some of these letters are deeply personal family history. Stories about George's great-grandfather, insights into royal protocol that would be invaluable for his education. You had no right to keep these from him." "I had every right to protect him from potentially overwhelming information," Camilla replied, though her conviction seemed to be wavering.
"Protect him?"
George looked up from the letters. "Or protect your own position as his advisor? You wanted to be the person who shaped my understanding of my role, and grandmother's influence threatened that."
Camilla's composure finally broke completely.
"Yes, all right.
Yes, I wanted to be the one to guide you. Is that so terrible? I love you like my own son, George.
I've watched you grow up, I've been there for every milestone, every challenge. Your grandmother has had 96 years to influence this family. Why can't I have the chance to help shape the next generation?" The raw honesty of her admission was more shocking than her lies had been. George realized that underneath all the manipulation and deception was a woman who felt threatened by his deep connection to his grandmother, who wanted to claim the primary maternal role in his life. "Because it's not your place to decide who I have relationships with," George said firmly. "And it's certainly not your place to lie and manipulate to achieve your goals." William gathered the letters together protectively.
"Camilla, what you've done is beyond inappropriate. You've caused tremendous pain to both George and his grandmother.
You've violated trust, manipulated staff members, and interfered with private family relationships. I suppose you're going to run straight to Charles with all of this," Camilla said bitterly.
"What happens next isn't up to me," William replied.
"But George deserves to have his relationship with his grandmother restored immediately, without any interference from you." George stood up, clutching the precious letters to his chest.
"I'm going to see her. Today. Right now."
"George, perhaps you should call her first," William suggested gently. "This has been a shock for everyone involved." But George was already moving toward the door. "She's been waiting for months to hear from me."
"I'm not making her wait another minute."
As he reached the door, he turned back to face Camilla one last time. "I trusted you. I thought you cared about me, about what was best for me. But you only cared about what was best for you.
Camilla's face crumpled. George, please. I do love you. Everything I did came from a place of love. No, George said quietly. Love doesn't lie. Love doesn't manipulate. Love doesn't steal letters from a grandmother to her grandson. What you did came from jealousy and ambition, not love. He left the office with his father beside him, the weight of the letters in his arms feeling like the most precious treasure he had ever carried. Behind them, Camilla sat alone at her desk, surrounded by the wreckage of her carefully constructed deception. As they walked through the corridors of the castle, William placed a supportive hand on George's shoulder. I'm sorry, son. I'm sorry I didn't see what was happening sooner. It's not your fault, father. She was very good at making it seem reasonable. They reached George's room, and William paused at the door. What do you need from me right now? George thought for a moment. I need to read these letters. All of them. And then, I need to call grandmother and explain what happened. And then, I need to go to her. I'll make arrangements for you to travel to Balmoral immediately. And, George, your grandmother is going to be overjoyed to hear from you. As William left, George spread the letters out on his bed in chronological order. Each one was a window into his grandmother's thoughts and feelings over the months they had been apart. She had written about the changing seasons at Balmoral, about books she was reading, about political developments she wanted to discuss with him. She had shared personal memories and family stories, offering him pieces of royal history that would have been invaluable for his education and development. But, more than anything, the letters were filled with love. Pure, unconditional love from a grandmother who missed her grandson and couldn't understand why he had stopped communicating with her. The pain in some of the later letters was almost unbearable to read, as she expressed worry about his well-being and wondered what she might have done to upset him. One letter, written just 2 weeks ago, brought tears to his eyes. My darling boy, I don't know if these letters are reaching you, but I continue to write them in hopes that someday you'll read them and know how much you mean to me. If I've done something to hurt or disappoint you, please tell me so I can make it right. You are one of the greatest joys of my life, and I cannot bear the thought that you might be suffering alone. George reached for his phone with shaking hands. It was time to make the most important call of his life, to restore the relationship that meant everything to him, and to begin healing the damage that months of lies and manipulation had caused. As he dialed his grandmother's number, George realized that this confrontation with Camilla was only the beginning. The trust that had been broken would take time to repair, and there would be consequences for what she had done that extended far beyond this moment. But right now, all that mattered was hearing his grandmother's voice and letting her know that he had never stopped loving her. The phone rang once, and George prepared to speak the words that would begin to heal both their hearts. The phone rang twice before George heard the familiar voice he had missed so desperately. Hello? Queen Elizabeth's voice was cautious, perhaps because she didn't recognize the number on her caller ID. Grandmother, George said, his voice breaking slightly on the word. It's George. The silence that followed lasted only seconds, but it felt like an eternity. Then, he heard something that nearly broke his heart, the sound of his grandmother beginning to cry. George? My darling boy, is it really you? Yes, grandmother. It's me. I'm so sorry. I'm so terribly sorry. Oh, my dear child, where have you been? I've been so worried about you. I thought perhaps you were angry with me, or that something terrible had happened to you. George closed his eyes, the pain in her voice almost unbearable. I've been trying to reach you for months. I was told you were very sick, that the doctor said you shouldn't have visitors or take calls. I was told you wouldn't remember me clearly and that seeing me might upset you. Sick? George, I haven't been sick a day. I've been writing you letters, calling constantly, asking everyone to help me reach you. Who told you I was sick? Camilla, George said simply, the name carrying the weight of all the betrayal he felt. The silence that followed was different from before. This time, George could almost hear his grandmother's sharp mind processing the implications of what he had just revealed. I see, she said finally, her voice taking on the steely tone he recognized from her most serious conversations. How long has this been going on? George spent the next 20 minutes explaining everything he had discovered, the intercepted phone calls, the redirected letters, the lies told to various staff members and family. His grandmother listened without interruption, occasionally making small sounds of disbelief or anger. Grandmother, I need you to know that not once, not for a single moment, did I want to stay away from you. I love you more than anything in this world, and losing contact with you has been the worst thing I've ever experienced. And I need you to know, she replied firmly, that this separation has been agony for me as well. You are the light of my life, George. You always have been. They talked for over an hour, with George reading passages from her letters and his grandmother explaining the context behind each one. She had indeed been working on her memoirs and had wanted to share certain stories with him before they were published. She had been following his academic progress through official reports but had desperately wanted to hear about his experiences in his own words. George, she said as their conversation began to wind down, I want you to come to Balmoral immediately. We have months of conversation to catch up on, and I'm not willing to wait another day. I've already asked Father to arrange transportation. I should be there by evening. Wonderful. And, George, we're going to need to have a very serious family discussion about what's happened. This cannot be allowed to stand without consequences. Meanwhile, across London, Catherine, Princess of Wales, was having her own revelation about the situation. She had been at a charity luncheon when she received an urgent call from William explaining what George had discovered about Camilla's deception. Kate, I need you to understand how serious this is, William said, his voice tight with controlled anger. Camilla has been systematically manipulating George's relationship with grandmother for months. She's intercepted letters, blocked phone calls, and lied to everyone about both of their wishes. Catherine felt a chill run down her spine. William, that's psychological manipulation on a massive scale. George must be devastated. He is. He's on his way to Balmoral now to see grandmother, but I'm worried about the long-term effects of this betrayal. He trusted Camilla completely, and she used that trust to isolate him from the person who means the most to him. Catherine's mind immediately went to her own children and the relationships they were building within the family. William, if she was willing to do this to George, what else might she be capable of? We need to protect Charlotte and Louis from any similar manipulation. I've been thinking the same thing. But, right now, my concern is for George. He's trying to hold it together, but I can see how much this has hurt him. After ending the call with William, Catherine found herself unable to concentrate on the charity event. She kept thinking about George, about the months he had spent believing his beloved grandmother was too sick to see him, about the confusion and pain both he and Queen Elizabeth must have experienced. But, more than anything, she found herself thinking about timing. Something about the timeline of Camilla's deception troubled her, and she couldn't quite put her finger on what it was. Catherine excused herself from the luncheon and drove directly to Windsor Castle. She needed to understand exactly when Camilla had begun her manipulation and what might have triggered it. She suspected there was more to this story than had been uncovered so far. She found William in his study, surrounded by phone records and documents that George had compiled during his investigation. William, I keep thinking about the timing of all this. When exactly did Camilla start intercepting George's communications with your grandmother? William consulted his notes. According to the various people George spoke with, the protocols were put in place about 6 months ago. 6 months ago, Catherine repeated thoughtfully. What was happening 6 months ago? What might have motivated Camilla to start this deception then? William thought back, reviewing family events and royal calendar items from that time frame. 6 months ago was when grandmother started talking more seriously about her memoirs, about sharing certain family stories that hadn't been made public before. What kind of stories? Stories about the early days of her reign, about some of the more challenging political situations she navigated. She specifically mentioned wanting to share these stories with George as part of his preparation for his future role. Catherine felt pieces of a puzzle beginning to click together in her mind. William, what if this wasn't just about Camilla wanting to be George's primary maternal influence? What if there were specific stories or information your grandmother wanted to share that Camilla didn't want George to hear? William's expression grew serious as he considered the implications. You think Camilla was trying to prevent George from learning certain family history? I think we need to find out what your grandmother was planning to tell George in those conversations and letters. There might be information there that someone wouldn't want to become public knowledge. They spent the next hour reviewing the letters George had retrieved from Camilla's office, looking for clues about what Queen Elizabeth had been trying to share with her great-grandson. What they found was deeply troubling.
In several letters, Queen Elizabeth made veiled references to important family history that she wanted to discuss with George in person. She mentioned having documents and correspondence that would help him understand the full scope of his heritage and responsibilities. Most significantly, she referenced wanting to share information about recent family developments that would affect his understanding of the monarchy's future. "William," Catherine said quietly, "I think your grandmother was planning to tell George something about Camilla specifically. Something that Camilla desperately didn't want him to know." William's face went pale. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking we need to get to Balmoral tonight." George is walking into this reunion with his grandmother without understanding that there might be additional revelations waiting for him. If Camilla went to these lengths to prevent certain information from reaching George, then that information must be significant. But George has been through so much already. Do you think he's ready for more family secrets? Catherine stood up, her decision made. "I think George deserves to know the truth, whatever it is. And I think your grandmother deserves to finally share whatever she's been trying to tell him for months." They made rapid arrangements to travel to Scotland, with Catherine insisting that they needed to arrive before George's conversation with his grandmother went too deep into potentially sensitive territory. As they drove toward the airfield, Catherine couldn't shake the feeling that they were racing against time. George had already been through the devastating experience of learning about Camilla's deception and manipulation. If there were additional secrets waiting to be revealed at Balmoral, she wanted to be there to support him through whatever came next. "William," she said as they boarded the plane, "promise me something. Whatever we learn tonight, whatever your grandmother tells George, we'll face it as a family. No more secrets, no more manipulation, no more lies." "I promise," William replied, though his expression suggested he was deeply worried about what they might discover. As their plane lifted off toward Scotland, Catherine found herself thinking about the young man who had started this day believing his grandmother was too sick to see him and who would end it possibly learning truths that could change his understanding of his family forever. George had already lost his innocence about the people he could trust. Catherine prayed that whatever additional revelations were coming wouldn't destroy his faith in family entirely. The race to reach Balmoral before irreversible damage was done had begun, and Catherine had no idea whether they would arrive in time to help George process whatever truths his grandmother had been desperate to share with him. At Balmoral, Queen Elizabeth sat in her private sitting room, reviewing documents and correspondence she had been saving for months, waiting for the right moment to share them with her beloved great-grandson. That moment had finally come, but she had no idea that the truth she was about to reveal would test George's resilience in ways that even Camilla's betrayal hadn't prepared him for. The convergence of secrets, lies, and long-hidden truths was about to reshape the royal family forever, and time was running out to ensure that George would have the support he needed to survive what was coming. George arrived at Balmoral just as the Scottish sun was beginning to set, casting long golden shadows across the heather-covered hills. The familiar sight of the castle brought tears to his eyes. This had always been his sanctuary, the place where he felt most at peace, and the separation from it had been one of the cruelest aspects of Camilla's deception. His grandmother was waiting for him in the entrance hall, and the sight of her, healthy, alert, and radiating the same strength and warmth he remembered, nearly overwhelmed him. She looked exactly as she always had, with no sign of the confusion or frailty Camilla had described. They embraced for a long moment, both of them crying quietly. When they finally separated, Queen Elizabeth cupped his face in her hands and looked at him with fierce love. "My dear boy, you've grown so much. I've missed you terribly." "I've missed you too, grandmother. More than I can possibly express." She led him to her private sitting room, the same room where they had shared countless conversations over the years. Tea was already prepared, and she poured for both of them with the same careful attention to detail she brought to everything. "George, before we talk about anything else, I need you to understand something. What Camilla did to you, to us, was not just wrong, it was cruel. You must never blame yourself for believing her lies or for staying away. She manipulated you very skillfully." George nodded, still struggling with feelings of guilt despite knowing intellectually that he had been the victim of the deception. However, his grandmother continued, "I believe her actions were motivated by more than simple jealousy or ambition. I think she was specifically trying to prevent me from sharing certain information with you." "What kind of information?" Queen Elizabeth rose from her chair and moved to an ornate writing desk in the corner of the room. She retrieved a thick leather portfolio and returned to sit beside George on the sofa. "Information about your family history that I believe you have a right to know, but that others might prefer to keep hidden." She opened the portfolio to reveal documents, photographs, and correspondence dating back several decades. George, what I'm about to tell you may be difficult to hear, but I believe you're mature enough to handle it, and your future role demands that you understand the full truth about our family's recent history. George felt a familiar knot of anxiety forming in his stomach, but he nodded for her to continue. The story begins with your grandfather's first marriage to Diana, she said gently. There are aspects of that relationship and its aftermath that have never been fully shared with you or your brother and sister. Over the next hour, Queen Elizabeth walked George through a comprehensive account of the relationship between Charles and Diana, including details about Charles's relationship with Camilla during his marriage to Diana. She showed him correspondence, diary entries, and official documents that painted a picture far more complex than the sanitized version George had been told growing up. You see, my dear, she explained, Camilla was never just your grandfather's friend who became important to him after your grandmother Diana's death. She was a significant presence in his life throughout his marriage to Diana, and many of the problems in that marriage stemmed from his inability to fully commit to Diana while maintaining his relationship with Camilla. George absorbed this information slowly, understanding that his family history was more complicated than he had realized, but not yet seeing why Camilla would have worked so hard to prevent him from learning this. But, grandmother, he said carefully, this information is difficult, but it's not devastating. Why would Camilla go to such lengths to prevent me from learning about the past? Queen Elizabeth's expression grew more serious. Because, my dear boy, the story doesn't end in the past. There are decisions being made right now about your future that are directly connected to this history. She turned to a section of the portfolio that contained much more recent documents, correspondence from the past year between various family members and advisors. George, there have been conversations about your education, your future role, and your preparation for the throne that you haven't been included in. Conversations that involve Camilla advocating for significant changes to royal protocol and tradition, changes that would fundamentally alter the monarchy you're destined to inherit. George leaned forward, his full attention focused on his grandmother's words. Camilla has been pushing for a more modern approach to the monarchy, which sounds reasonable on the surface. But what she actually means is a monarchy with less emphasis on tradition, less connection to historical precedent, and less influence from family members who represent the old ways of doing things. Family members like you, George said, understanding beginning to dawn. Exactly. She saw my influence over you as a threat to her vision for the future of the royal family. By keeping us apart, she hoped to shape your understanding of your role without my outdated perspectives interfering. Queen Elizabeth showed George documents outlining proposals for changes to royal education protocols, succession planning, and even the coronation ceremony. Many of these proposals bore Camilla's input and advocacy. She wanted to create a new kind of monarch, one less bound by tradition, less constrained by historical precedent, more willing to adapt the institution to contemporary expectations. In theory, some of these ideas have merit. In practice, she was trying to remake the monarchy in her own image. George felt anger rising in his chest as he realized the full scope of what had been done to him. She wasn't just keeping me away from you because she was jealous. She was preventing you from preparing me for my actual role because she wanted to prepare me for a different role entirely. Precisely. And, George, there's something else. Something that makes her actions even more concerning. Queen Elizabeth turned to the final section of the portfolio, which contained recent correspondence between Camilla and various media outlets and political figures. Camilla has been having conversations, unauthorized conversations, with journalists and political advisors about the future direction of the monarchy. She's been positioning herself not just as the queen consort, but as the primary architect of the institution's evolution. George stared at documents showing meeting schedules, email correspondence, and even draft articles that quoted Camilla extensively about her vision for modernizing the royal family. She's been building her own power base, he said quietly. Yes, and she's been doing it without your grandfather's full knowledge or approval. Many of these meetings and conversations happened without proper protocol or oversight. The enormity of the deception was becoming clear to George. Camilla hadn't just manipulated his relationship with his grandmother, she had been systematically working to reshape the entire monarchy according to her own vision, using her position as queen consort to build influence and relationships that extended far beyond her official role. Grandmother, does my father know about this? Some of it, yes. But not the full extent. I've been gathering this information for months, planning to present it to the family as a cohesive picture of what's been happening behind the scenes. Just then, they heard voices in the entrance hall, and Queen Elizabeth smiled slightly. "It sounds like William and Catherine have arrived. I asked them to come tonight because I felt you would need their support as we discussed these matters." George felt a wave of relief. The information he was processing was overwhelming, and the thought of having his father and Catherine there to help him make sense of it was comforting. William and Catherine entered the sitting room looking travel-weary but determined. After quick greetings, Queen Elizabeth brought them up to speed on what she had been sharing with George. "William," she said seriously, "the situation with Camilla is far worse than we initially realized. Her manipulation of George was part of a much larger agenda to reshape the monarchy without proper consultation or approval." William examined the documents with growing alarm, while Catherine sat beside George, offering silent support as he processed the magnitude of what he was learning. "Mother," William said finally, using the formal address he reserved for his grandmother in her official capacity, "these documents suggest that Camilla has been operating well outside the bounds of her role. Some of these conversations with media figures could be considered breaches of royal protocol." "They absolutely are breaches of protocol," Queen Elizabeth replied firmly. "And they represent a fundamental betrayal of the trust placed in her when she married Charles." George looked around at his family, feeling simultaneously grateful for their support and overwhelmed by the complexity of the situation he now found himself in. "What happens now?" he asked quietly. Queen Elizabeth reached over and took his hand. "Now we tell the truth. All of it. To your grandfather, to the rest of the family, and to anyone else who needs to understand what's been happening." Catherine spoke up for the first time since arriving. "George, I want you to know that regardless of what comes next, you have our complete support. What was done to you is wrong, and we're going to make sure it never happens again." George felt tears threatening again, but this time they were tears of relief rather than pain. After months of confusion and isolation, he was finally surrounded by people he could trust, people who were committed to honesty and transparency. "There will be consequences for Camilla," William said firmly. "Her actions have damaged not just our family relationships, but potentially the integrity of the institution itself." "But, grandmother," George said, "I need to understand something. Despite everything Camilla has done, despite all the lies and manipulation, she did seem to genuinely care about me in some ways. How do I reconcile that with everything I've learned tonight?" Queen Elizabeth considered the question carefully before answering. "People are complex, my dear. It's possible that Camilla did develop genuine affection for you while simultaneously using that relationship to further her own agenda. The fact that she cared for you doesn't excuse what she did, but it might explain why she was able to maintain the deception for so long." George nodded, understanding that healing from this betrayal would require him to hold multiple truths simultaneously, that he had been manipulated and used, but also that the relationship hadn't been entirely false. As the evening wore on, the family continued to discuss the implications of what had been revealed. Plans were made for confronting Camilla and Charles together, for implementing new protocols to prevent similar manipulation in the future, and for ensuring that George's education and preparation for his future role could proceed without interference. But, most importantly, George and his grandmother began the process of rebuilding their relationship, sharing the conversations and connections that had been stolen from them over the past months. As George finally prepared to retire for the night in his familiar room at Balmoral, he reflected on how much had changed in a single day. He had started the morning believing his grandmother was too sick to see him. He was ending the day understanding that he had been the victim of a sophisticated manipulation designed to reshape his entire future without his knowledge or consent. The road ahead would be difficult, with family confrontations and institutional changes required to address what had happened. But, for the first time in months, George felt like he knew the truth, and he was surrounded by people committed to protecting that truth. His relationship with his grandmother had not only been restored, but had been deepened by their shared commitment to honesty and transparency. The woman who had always been his guide and mentor had once again proven that her wisdom and love could overcome any obstacle placed in their path. The deception was over, but the real work of healing and rebuilding was just beginning.